Thanks to a wealth of published scholarship, the political, socio-economic and cultural context in which direct transfers of cultural capital between England and the Low Countries took place during the 11th and 12th centuries is now relatively well understood. And as Elizabeth, Maureen and Jeroen have shown so brilliantly in the first three papers of this session, much exciting work is currently being done on personal connections, personal links between authors and patrons in the two regions. And of course, they are building on earlier work that deals with the same question. In contrast, a great deal of additional research is in order so that we might get a better grasp of the institutional connections via which these transfers took place. For instance, recent studies by Guido Cariboni and Johan Belaan have shown that from the middle of the 11th century onwards, the heads of religious houses in France and the Low Countries drastically expanded the remit of confraternity agreements to facilitate the exchange between institutions of expert staff and know-how, thereby facilitating, among other things, the exchange of texts, the mobility of authors, and the dissemination of new trends in literary composition. However, the current state of knowledge on the emergence of these agreements, this new type of agreements, their geographical scope, their precise contents, and also their implications on the shorter and the longer term remains very incomplete, due, among other things, to the fact that systematically cataloging the relevant evidence would require a huge research effort across national and disciplinary boundaries. Now, considering these challenges for research, some observers might feel that it would be premature or even redundant to also look at instances where cultural capital was exchanged between the two regions via an indirect route. However, if we want to get as full as a picture as possible of how literary cultures in England and the Low Countries mutually influenced each other, of what factors drove the circulation of specific literary genres and individual texts between the two regions, and especially also of how these genres and texts acquired significant metadata along their journey, then taking that type of evidence into account is vital, I think. To make my point, I shall look at the example of the mortuary role of Matilda, the first abbess of Saint-Trinité, and as Lisbeth pointed out, I forgot to mention that Saint-Trinité is in Caen, indeed, who died on the 6th of July, 1113. Between summer 1113 and 1114, a rolliger, literally a roll bearer, offered the document for inspection and inscription in at least 257 religious institutions. Early on in his journey, he collected at least 62 such inscriptions in England, which he subsequently carried to up to 100 communities in Normandy and France before taking the cumulative whole to St. Peter's Abbey in Ghent. In this paper, I shall argue that the role and its poetic contents, which would have been of great interest to this group of Flemish monks, not just as an opportunity to study then current trends in poetic composition, but also because of the role and its carrier's status as conduits of information about political, socio-economic, and institutional trends in the regions they had previously visited. At the same time, I will also suggest that it would be unwise to consider the information they might have retrieved regarding the English stage of the role's journeys separately from that which they harvested, so to speak, regarding subsequent ones. Now, we have a fairly good idea of how Matilda's role acquired its contents. After the rolliger presented himself at each of his stops, the head of the host community would arrange for one of his subjects to read aloud the litera, which is the text at the beginning of the roll, and describes Matilda's pious death and extols her virtue during a chapter meeting. Typically, the rolliger withdrew at this point to rest or eat, but before doing so, he invited his host to inscribe on the roll a titulus, which consisted of a note of condolence, a few names of deceased individuals, and, if they wished, a poem. Jean Dufour's reconstruction of the roll tells us that at least 110 communities submitted a titulus that included all three of these elements. Predictably, the majority of the poems are funerary in nature and were written or at least adapted so that they contained a reference to Abbess Mathilde. However, the frequency with which the documents were offered for inscription at religious institutions, their redundant nature in the eyes of some contemporary observers, and the fact that they circulated in many contexts that had no direct connection to the deceased and their home institution, all explain why about 36 poets took advantage of the opportunity to show off their literary talents, satirize the status and conduct of others, particularly nuns, vent their feelings about current events, or even give advice to the members of communities situated further on the Rolliger's route. The heterogeneous content of the roll first emerged during the document's journey in England, which, trying to go to the next slide, sorry. So journey in England, which is where the Rolliger had taken it after having briefly visited in Normandy during the late summer or early fall of 1113. The roll's journey more or less corresponds with a well-trodden path for such documents such as that of Bruno the Carthusian and Vitalis of Savigny. However, the yields in terms of its poetic offerings were greater than that of the two other documents. And I'll swiftly move to the next slide, sorry. Out of 62 English institutions featured on the roll, 2 female and 15 male ones submitted tituli that contained poetry, compared to respectively 8 in the roll of Bruno the Carthusian and 14 in that of Vitalis of Savigny. And if we compare the roll's English contents to that which was added during its continental journey, we find that the ratio of submissions with poetry is much higher for the former section. Off-topic poetry in that part of the roll is also rare and limited to one example added by Scholaris in Bath, who mock nuns, but all the other texts are quite solemn. Most of submissions are all also specifically dedicated to Matilda, and all of this would have made the English contents of the roll quite distinct to later readers, including to the monks of St. Peter in Ghent. Now, before speculating on how the roll and its contents might have been perceived at the Flemish Abbey, we must begin by taking a look at the possible reasons why the English part of this document is so distinct in terms of its scope and contents. To begin with, a look at Saint-Trinité's origins makes it obvious that the death of its first leader would have been received as a major event throughout the Anglo-Norman world. Founded circa 1059 by no less than William the Conqueror and his wife Matilda as a dynastic sanctuary dedicated to the couple's memory and that of their relatives, the Abbey's emergence had been part of a project to elevate the town to what Cassandra Potts has described as a second capital of Normandy. But the reputation of the Abbey and its members went beyond its mere status as a ducal foundation and its auspicious location. By the mid-1080s, the patronage of William, and especially Matilda, had turned the Abbey into one of the wealthiest institutions for women religious in Normandy, featuring an estate that included 7 manors in different parts of England. Undoubtedly, this helped cement both the Abbey's renown there and its close connection to the Anglo-Norman court. And another contributing factor was that the royal couple had offered their daughter Cecilia as an oblate to the Saint-Trinité community. From circa 1103 onwards, she assumed control over the Abbey's administration and inner workings with resounding success. And she and her nuns also made sure that the Abbey's prestige was widely publicized. The creation of Matilda's role, and especially the littera at the beginning, qualify as an ambitious effort to put their institution on the map as a literary center. All these things made the roll a document of high interest to its English recipients, and the idea of associating oneself with its prestige through poetry, an attractive one, which probably explains why there is so much poetry in that part of the world, and also why so much is quite solemn and focused on the figure of Matilda. Now, on to the next slide. On returning to Normandy, the Rolliger first visited the most important religious houses he had left aside in his run-up to his English voyage. And then he traveled west, following the coastline as far as Mont Saint-Michel. From there, he went to inland Brittany, as far down as Nantes, then followed the Loire eastwards, then traveled south to Beaulieu, Noyers, and then Poitiers. And at this point, he turned westwards to Saint-Michel-en-Lerme, and then again southward to Saintes. His journey subsequently continued in an eastern direction, but in Saint-Léonard-de-Noblat, he headed north to the valley of the Indre, from where he headed east to Nevers. And having crossed the border of Burgundy, he traveled north again to Sens, then Troyes, and then up to the region of Laon. And from the diocese of Laon, the Rolliger finally crossed into the Low Countries. Now, his trajectory in that region is not documented, even though we can be certain that he must have visited at least a dozen institutions commonly visited by those who carried mortuary rolls, including Saint-Bertin, Anchin, Marchienne, and several other places. We do know, however, that he went to St. Peter's in Ghent because we have an inscription from that institution. And we also know that Abbot Ansbold instructed the local scholaris to compose a poem. And this is it. And I now realize that I forgot to include an English translation of the poem. And I hope that people who can manage the Latin will enjoy the text. Judging by the contents of that particular poem, the monk's response to Matilda's death was rather tepid, which is not a surprise since we have no indication at all of a direct connection between Saint-Trinité's and St. Peter's. From the Ghent scholar's viewpoint, the opportunity to study poetry added in the Rolliger's earlier stops must have seemed of far greater interest, and so must have been that of looking at which places on the Roll's route hosted talented authors or offered relevant schooling. Furthermore, the fact that the tituli on Matilda's roll were inscribed over a very short period of time and were drawn from a very broad geographical area must have added greatly to their interest. When the roll arrived in Ghent, it contained at least 163 tituli, slightly less than a third of which held poetry by religious institutions in Normandy, England, Aquitaine, Poitou, Burgundy, and Champagne. And in terms of its thematic scope and its institutional and cultural influences too, the roll had become a great deal more complex since it had left England. Now, exactly how obvious this complexity was to his Flemish hosts is hard to say, especially if we consider that they probably had little time, a few days at most, to study the roll's contents. However, that does not mean that they would have not recognized the English tituli as a distinct category. The sheer density of poetic content from that region may well have struck readers, as would have the fact that most are very solemn, as I mentioned, and in a handful of cases also quite personal in nature. One of the poems was written by Matilda's niece. Another distinguishing feature were the numerous stilistical and compositional peculiarities. For instance, the entry from St. Mary's in Winchester features unusual hexametric verses, all of which end with the word Maria in a style that echoes that of tropes. The Hume entry is similar in construction. The poem from St. Peter's in Westminster has all but one of the verses end with Arthur, and each of the three poems from St. Mary's in York is in elegiac distichs, which admittedly is a form we also encounter in some continental tituli. At least some of the roll's readers, including perhaps those in Ghent, must have picked up on these unusual features. In fact, anyone who made the effort to spend at least a few hours studying the document would have noticed that there was much that was typically English or Anglo-Norman, but rather typically English about its contents. That the roll probably did not spend much time in Ghent also hardly means that the St. Peter monks did not pay attention to where exactly it had traveled, what metadata it had acquired since leaving Caen, and what information the Rolliger had gathered along his journey. The cultural, political, and economic links between Flanders and English made lay and ecclesiastical agents in the former region especially alert to any news from that part of the world. But the St. Peter's community also stood to gain from a careful monitoring of the situation in England for a specific region, which was that it owned several English estates. To ensure their institutions' control over these and to maintain the flow of revenues to Flanders, the monks surely did their utmost to gather current information on the political situation across the Channel, including from unannounced visitors, such as the Rolliger. And given that the political situation in England was rather unstable at the time, their eagerness to pick his brain must have been even greater. Conceivably, they were also keen to find out more about the Saint-Trinité's nun's literary achievement in the litera and his function as a signifier of their intention to establish the abbey as a major cultural center. And also about the fact that so many institutions in Normandy, and especially in England, had responded to that literary statement by adding one of their own. Perhaps they subjected him to a barrage of questions about the circumstances in which this remarkable document had originated and about how it had evolved during that part of its journey. Now, alongside this interest in Anglo-Norman literary culture, monastic networking, and politics, the presence of the roll and the Rolliger at Ghent may well have had another appeal that was unrelated, or so we think, to the situation in Normandy and England. Both had journeyed through regions in France where tensions had been brewing over the Cluniac's involvement in monastic institutions. And from early on in his tenure, Abbot Hugh of Cluny had concluded confraternity agreements with abbeys across France and the Low Countries that gave him the right to select one of his monks to become abbot in an associate monastery. Over time, the stakeholders in these houses became concerned that Hugh would hollow out their independence by sending in his own monks and by using the abbot's vow of obedience to him in order to create a community of property with Cluny, with the result that these places would be demoted to mere priories. As he was pursuing his mission in late 1113 and in 1114, the Saint-Trinité Rolliger called at several communities where these issues were current at the time. In the Diocese of Saintes in Western France, for instance, monks of the Cluniac Priory of Sainte-Trinité submitted a long poem to complain about the anti-Cluniac sentiments of the local population. And their next-door neighbors, the canons of Saint-Vivien, responded with a scorching attack on Cluniac monks and their devious ways. And if anyone is interested in that, I published an article on that particular poem in the Journal of Medieval History last year. Now, subsequent readers of the roll would have been intrigued by the conflict that is evoked in the two poems, and presumably some also asked the Rolliger about their meaning, and more generally about the latest institutional developments at his earliest stops. And this may have been especially the case in Flanders, and I do think it was especially the case in Flanders, where tensions over the Cluniacs' involvement in monastic governance were running high at the time. When Matilda's roll arrived in Ghent, the campaign to establish a Flemish movement of emancipation for Cluny was well underway. Among other influences, the Rolliger's oral reports, and perhaps also the reading of the inflammatory poetry from Saintes, might have contributed to Flemish abbots' determination to pursue their project. And we have quite clear evidence of efforts in the years 1114 to 1118 to establish a number of confraternities between institutions that had at their heads anti-Cluniac abbots. All of these efforts culminated in the first general chapter of Benedictine abbots of 1131, at which a group of 22 abbots formally declared their independence from Cluny. I'm fairly confident that an in-depth research effort on the individual status of communities where the roll was submitted in England, but also on the continent, its trajectory, and also the contents of individual poems will yield further new insights in how it was used by its creators and its inscribers to circulate potentially controversial views on monastic identity and monastic governance in a wide geographical area. So to briefly conclude, in this paper, I hope to have shown that Matilda's roll deserves as much attention for its role as a conduit of metadata as for its memorial function and its literary content. Moreover, these things were in fact inextricably interlinked due to the specific literary and institutional context in which this document originated, the political and ideological meanings it acquired along his journey, the experiences of the Rolliger, and the oral reports he was able to provide his hosts. Clearly, there is much new to be discovered about its significance if we are willing to look at it differently. Rather than studying the roll's appearance once it was returned for the last time to Saint-Trinité, we need to turn to its incremental growth in the years 1113-14, during its long journey away, and then back home to Caen. Thank you.